For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Murli. Joining me today are investigative journalists Micah Reddy and Pauli van Wyk, here to discuss their book, Malema, Money, Power, Patronage. Can you talk to us about the motivation behind writing Malema? Why is this a good moment to critically examine Julius Malema's life and how he makes his money?
The book's been a very long time coming. We signed the book contract years ago, and it made sense for the two of us to collaborate because we were both sitting with large amounts of information on Malema and his network. But it was very different information. So Poli had a whole lot of stuff that was very different to what I had, and it was complementary. And it made sense to write a book on Malema because it was a very long time since anything was written on him, any book. The last book was Fiona Ford's unauthorized biography from about I think it was around 2011, 2012. And a lot had happened since then. He'd formed the EFF. The EFF was this very influential party, third largest in the country, and he had accumulated yet more controversies and scandals. So we thought it needed to come out. Why it came out at this point was just fate, really. There was a lot of legaling, a lot of editing. It's quite tricky when two authors are writing one book, so we had to make it sound like one voice, and a lot of fact checking, plus news around Malema and the EFF was developing. There was always more to add to the book. So that's why it came out now, and that's why we thought we needed this book out.
Yeah, so everything Micah said, and then, in my opinion, he is one of the most talented, if not the most talented politicians in the country. And I think is misunderstood in many quarters. No matter what your politics is, there's very few people who has a full picture of understanding of Julius Malema. So for the first time, someone is telling the narrative of how he developed into what he is today. There are some biographical aspects to the book, but it's a book about his money and how he uses his power to gain more money. So of course it's a book about Malema, the man, and his power and his patronage network. But it's also a story about South Africa and how money courses through our politics. He exemplifies many other politicians and how money is, and entrepreneurs and tenderpreneurs are used to gain personal and private wealth.
Now, there are three key focus areas for this book: VBS Mutual Bank, the on-point engineering tender scandal, and the city of Johannesburg. What factors do you discern in analyzing these three situations?
The On Point case tells the story of a company that Julius had a secret stake in around 2009 to 2012-13. And it was a company that was appointed by the Government Department of Roads and Transport in 2009 through a fraudulent tender. And it ended up fleecing the taxpayer of millions of rand for shoddy work done. And then at least half of the money ended up with Julius. So On Point at the time funded his lifestyle, paid like Eskom bills, and his fleet of cars, upkeep of his cars, but also refurbishments of his homes, new properties bought, boxes and boxes full of cash. So the story is interesting just purely based on the facts. And those facts are derived mostly from a court case that Julius fought with SARS, because SARS at the time really investigated Julius quite well. They registered Project Caesar that was focused on Lesiba Gwangwa, a friend of Julius and a co-owner of On Point Engineering, and Julius's network. And so SARS, in their fight with Julius, gained and retrieved at least two witnesses' affidavits bolstered with receipts. So much of the information come from verifiable, actionable information that has already been tested by a court. And what was helpful in that case is that we sat then with Julius Malema's own opinion in many ways. So he had to explain in many ways where the money came from, how it came that he had it, and that was quite valuable to us. The VBS case is similar, but different because it didn't go through a court. What we have is bank statements and banking documents and information leaked to us. And what we do have is then SARS later on sequestrated some of the companies involved. So we have a lot of financial data that we base those chapters on.
And then the city of Joburg story is, well, it's more than Johannesburg. It's actually Johannesburg and Tshwane in particular. And that's a story about how the EFF and how Malema, Shivambu, and another key player in all of this is Marshal Dlamini, who is the Secretary General of the EFF. And he was a kind of key fixer in the metros. He was a money man, businessman, politician. And this story, the story of the metros, is really how the three of them and the EFF were able to exercise sort of outsized influence in the metros by virtue of being kingmakers in coalition politics. So they were a relatively small party, but the DA-led coalitions relied on them to get things done in the metros. They relied on their collaboration or consent, for instance, to pass budgets and policies. And so the EFF began to wield influence well beyond its vote share. And that's how they were able to influence tenders and capture city entities. And we see this in multiple cases. So the one story is about AfriRent. It was this big fleet contract that the EFF looked to be meddling in, and they received kickbacks. Malema received kickbacks from the contractor that won this questionable bid. In that case, we had new information on an old story that I had published long before we wrote the book. Then there was the story of City Power that was new, and we detail how Mashaba basically let the EFF hold sway over City Power and kind of penetrate the entity, get their people in there. And contractors that won, again, another very questionable bid, paid Malema kickbacks. Then there was the city of Tshwane, where we show in great detail how the contractor that won a massive fuel tender worth R500 million was paying Malema and Marshal Dlamini at every step of the procurement process. So as the bid went out, as it was adjudicated, et cetera, and then once it was awarded, and then after it was awarded, because this contractor had this massive payday, because basically we go into a lot of detail in the book, but the tender was completely rigged and the contractor gamed the system. And so was able to rip off the city and made massive amounts from this dodgy tender. And so Malema had helped as a sort of rainmaker and earned huge rents from that tender. So that's basically what the Metro story is about. It's about how the EFF wielded their political influence to influence tenders and administrative processes in the city.
You've mentioned Herman Mashaba turning a blind eye to the EFF's wrongdoings. Action SA's national chairperson, Michael Beaumont, has come out in defense of the party leader, saying that the chapters about Mashaba in your book were not factual, and he goes on to try to refute some of the claims made in the book. How do you respond to that?
He refutes them in sort of broad statements, but he doesn't deal with any of the substance of what we write about. We have email records, we have tender documents, we have investigative reports, we have audit reports, we have a whole range of evidence to show that Mashaba effectively enabled Malema. Now, we're not saying that Mashaba necessarily knew of the corruption or how it works. We're not saying he knew of the mechanics of it, but he certainly bent over backwards to appease his EFF partners in ways that were highly questionable and in ways that definitely enabled the sort of corruption that we detail.
And I just add that there's a huge difference between refuting and denying. They denied it, but you only refute with proper evidence, and nothing against Micah's story on that was brought in terms of evidence.
So the EFF often positions itself as a voice for the marginalized. So how did the facts uncovered in your book square with the party's public image and stated values?
There's some interesting cases in the book that show how the EFF is instrumentalized for narrow interests, for the interests of the leadership, and how in certain cases this runs completely counter to their stated ideals. So, for example, there's a chapter in the book about Adriano Mazzotti and a mine that he had with his business partners. They had this mine in Limpopo, a chrome mine operation, complete fly-by-night operation. And they were alleged to have hired a gang of local thugs, basically, and enforcers to suppress community protests against this mine. The community were outraged because of the way that this mine came about, basically, and They accused the mine of flouting all sorts of laws and regulations and going over the heads of the community and signing a deal with the faction of the tribal leadership. And so the community were outraged. Naturally, the local EFF sided with the community and took up their cause. And we have evidence, including testimony from EFF members, former EFF members, who were involved in all of that, who took up the cause, and then were told, allegedly, to stand down after Mazotti phoned Malema and said, call off your guys. And Malema, he allegedly obliged. Josi Butane, who was a provincial strongman in Limpopo, was also involved in that. So these are the ways, and I mean, if you look at VBS, of course, and Pauli can talk more about that, it's, in the case of VBS, I think it's even more egregious.
Yeah, the VBS case is interesting, and also because we have an under oath version of the person in the room. Shafiwa Matotsi was the chair of VBS at the time, and he said he approached Julius and Floyd when they criticized heavily, specifically Julius, in their political rallies and on television, the loan VBS gave to former President Jacob Zuma. So Matotsi approached them and said, well, we're on the same team. This is the Black Bank. We are brothers. You need to help us. You don't need to criticize us. Let's work together and we will give the EFF money. So Julius said, yes, well, let's go for that. And they ensured that they gave a bank account to Shafiwa Matotsi, and that bank account was Schameka Projects, ostensibly owned by Brian Shivambu. And it had nothing to do with the EFF. Even though the EFF later on did receive 1.3 million rand from Schameka, it was clearly a front for Julius and for Floyd. So from Schameka, the money went to two different slush funds, which each of those were used by Julius and Floyd as their private piggy banks. So it's interesting where Micah's story about the Limpopo mine refers to an action being withdrawn. The story about VBS then is about a silence being bought. And I think it does show that right through the book, there are stories that suggest it's Julius's private interests first, and then the rest of the country and the party.
Now, your book also looks at the National Prosecuting Authority and claims that its weaknesses have ensured that Malema continues to survive politically. How exactly have NPA weaknesses assisted Malema?
Well, it's a long story, but in short, so the On Point case was withdrawn in 2015 when the court at the time threw it out because Lisiba Gwangwa was ill again and again and again. And at the time, Julius was charged with 51 charges of racketeering, money laundering, fraud, bribery, a number of different charges. And the NPA just never reinstated those. And a number of questions arise from that. Why would that be? They had at least two excellent witnesses who sat in On Point, who gave affidavits under oath, who could describe everything that happened at the time. The NPA knew there were new scandals coming about, but also we know that at the time Jacob Zuma was getting stronger, and the Hawks and the NPA at the time was already hollowed out. So it tells a story about state institutions being captured for private interests. And if you chase out the good people, and if it's hollowed out to the point where it's not functioning, then this is what happens. People like Julius Malema refine their crimes. They refine their modus operandi. And that's when you get a case like VBS or AfriRent or the rest of the metros, where they simply used more slush funds or more steps in between themselves and the money flows, just getting smarter about how they steal from the taxpayer. And if the NPA is not doing their job, and if the Hawks can't give a proper prosecutable investigation to the NPA, then we are sitting with a problem like we are doing now. Julius is busy making and creating legitimate businesses with stolen money. And in 10 years' time, it's going to be very difficult to find the origin of the money that he built those businesses with. And he's just going to argue, but I'm getting my wealth from the businesses that I built over time. But we should always remember that this is a person who receives 1.2 to 1.3 million rand before tax from Parliament, with no other businesses declare to Parliament. And what the book also shows is that he owns a massive property portfolio worth an estimable 14 million rand. And all you have to do is to go and ask, how did you amass that kind of wealth? Where does the money come from? And you follow the thread. And then it's quite easy to understand and to realize and to investigate that there's something very amiss and wrong here. But the Hawks and the prosecuting authorities either are not capable of doing it, do not have the will to do it, and may actually be snowed under if we really want to argue in their defense. This week, I was on a different forum with Shamila Batoy, the NDPP, and she said two things that was quite disconcerting. She's nearing her end of term, and she said at the start she did not realize that it would be close to impossible to prosecute organized corruption, which is something that should worry us all, coming from the NDPP. And the second worrying thing was, she said, that it appears that there are some cases where the willpower to prosecute lacks. And I think that's something that the country needs to sit up and listen to, and we need to do something about it, because if the NPA and the Hawks are not doing their job, and if they are partisan, we are heading for trouble.
And lastly, whether readers admire Malema or are critical of him, what do you hope that they take away from your book?
I think, having spent many years writing about the man and his political network, I think I can quite confidently speak for both Pauli and I here that we can't help but admire him to some degree. He is a very impressive politician. There have been moments when he and the EFF have been a force for some good, if you think of the way that the EFF took on state capture and Zuma during the Zuma years, when Malema was, in the eyes of the public, somewhat rehabilitated, even though he was engaging in pretty heinous crimes of corruption, VBS and so on. But it has been a party that has been hugely influential, and he's a politician who remains hugely influential. Whenever he speaks, people listen, and he's very much set the tone for politics. And you think again back to the Zuma years, and for instance, the EFF's Constitutional Court challenges, the Nkandla case, and so on. It shows that when Malema really wanted to, he could contribute in positive ways to the political development of the country. That said, overall, I think he is a demagogue at heart, and has become increasingly more so over the years, especially as these many scandals have caught up with him, and especially in the last year or so, as his power has been undermined, and as the EFF has lost vote share, and as I think he feels his hold over the party is weakening. So he's a complex character, and I think we've tried to capture that in the book. We've never had the chance to interview him properly. I think, Pauli, you've met him briefly before. I've asked him a question at a press conference, but we've never really sat down with him and got to know him on a personal level. And he banned the organizations we were working for, and banned us from attending his press conferences, and labeled us agents of Stratcom and so on. So we weren't really able to do justice to the man's personality, although we glean a lot of insight from the investigative work that we've done. And I think that's what we want to show, is how complex the man is, how complex his political party is, how fraught the political landscape is. But also, we want to show that it's not just about Malema. We want to tell a story about something bigger than Malema, which is about the nature of corruption in this country, or at least a lot of corruption in this country, and why it is that people like Malema thrive. So, it's very easy to just dismiss Malema as a crook, as inherently corrupt. But that doesn't really take us very far. I mean, he's the sort of bogeyman in South African politics, where people attribute so many of South Africa's ills to Malema and a handful of other politicians like him. But actually, he exemplifies a lot of what is wrong in our politics, but I don't think it's helpful just to dismiss him as a bogeyman. Like, he is a complex human being, and he's symptomatic of much broader political malaise in this country, much broader sort of societal problems. And in order to begin really addressing those, we have to understand how it is that people like Malema are able to thrive in this country.
Yeah, everything that Micah said. And I would add then, I would want people to gain the truth from this book. There's nothing in it that we cannot back up in court. We have the evidence. We've investigated this thoroughly. We have gone through several layers of lawyering where they ask us, can you prove this? Can you prove this? And everything that there's just half a question mark about has been thrown out of the book. I do think that, we need a proper picture of the politicians that we vote for and that we support. And we need to understand the broader picture of South African politics, which this case typifies.
That was Micah Reddy and Pauli van Wyk speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about their book, Malema. Visit the Polity website to access more author interviews, news, and information updates. If you haven't already, subscribe to Polity's email services, including our new monthly Polity Bookshelf email, to stay informed about the latest news and Polity Bookshelf developments.